Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today is Sunday the 16th of October. Now I'm going to read an article by Alasdair Macleod from Gold Money, and this was written on the 13th of October, 3 days ago. How not to manage a currency. Make no mistake, sterling's collapse is a very serious development and has serious consequences for sterling interest rates. While it is becoming apparent that interest rates are going to have to rise possibly for all currencies on a year view, sterling's problems are the consequences of bad judgment and perhaps intellectual arrogance on the part of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC. The MPC in turn is not and cannot be dependent from the influence of Mark Carney, the bank's governor, who made the expensive error of intervening in the Remain campaign. Many commentators are saying that sterling was overvalued and the fall will stimulate exports. But value is wholly subjective and not formulaic, as the ivory tower economists would have us believe. The idea of stimulating exports through lower currency rates overlooks the depressing effect of the transfer of wealth it triggers from 90% plus of the population in favour of foreigners and owners of export businesses. That is the point about stagflation. Do not forget the bank's stated objective, its mission statement, which is on the front page of its website. It is, quote, promoting the good of the people by maintaining monetary and financial stability, end quote. Monetary stability is further defined by the bank elsewhere as, quote, stable prices and confidence in the currency, end quote. Therefore, this year it has failed spectacularly in its basic mission, as the chart below shows. The loss of sterling's purchasing power against the currencies since in January has been the least against the headline US dollar at 17.5%. It has been marginally worse at 19% against the euro and considerably more against the yen and gold. Unless there is a sustained recovery in the sterling in the coming months, the rate of price inflation, irrespective of the outlook for economic activity, will most likely exceed 5% next year. Unilever, for example, is trying to force through price increases of 10% on its range of household and food products. The bank will be forced to raise interest rates considerably to get price inflation back under control. And guys, currently across the UK mainstream media channels, Unilever is a British-Dutch multinational consumer goods company. Headquarters are in Rotterdam, and they basically bring a lot of food and things into the UK. And there's been lots of talk about things like Marmite, for example, across the media, saying that they're not going to be able to bring it in because of the price differences. So there's lots of discussions about what sort of goods are going to be imported to the UK. But as per normal, all they will end up doing is increasing the charge for the items, thus inflation. So getting back on topic, mistakes led to a change in outlook for sterling. It's worth considering what went wrong so that we can better assess the future for sterling and the British economy, and to learn lessons that may apply to the currencies as well. Major central bank policies are all driven by the same macroeconomic assumptions, so sterling's troubles may well be repeated elsewhere in due course. At the root of the currency problem is an assumption on the part of central bankers that they have primacy over markets. The primacy has become increasingly evident since the breakdown of Gibbon's paradox, 1975 to 1982 period, when interest rates no longer reflected demand for savings by business investors. They began to set the monetary policy aimed at managing consumer demand instead. It marked an economic evolution away from commercial activity in favour of purely financial, and as that trend gathered momentum, central banks exercised more and more control over the deployment of capital. Notably, governments were able to finance their accumulating deficits with progressively lower interest rates, taking financing costs towards the lower bound. It is a process that cannot continue indefinitely, because as the old adage goes, markets eventually reassert themselves. This adage is a summation of all that's wrong with the monetary and financial collectivism, inability of central planning to allocate capital resources as efficiently as free markets. Sooner or later, a mistake, change in circumstances, or a black swan event leads to a financial or currency crisis. And guys, I'll stop there. Although Alasdair doesn't cover like serious geopolitical events, we're getting that information from other sources. But what Alasdair actually pinpoints is everything relating to metals and markets. That's his speciality. I mean, he is more than aware of what's going on, but he doesn't actually release geopolitical tensions. But nonetheless, he is stating right here, black swan or a financial currency crisis. And we all know what can create black swans and currency crises. It isn't just a market instability. It can be a global impacting factor. So carrying on. This happens from time to time, and every time the lenders of last resort manage to save their carefully constructed artifices, they say there are lessons learned and it won't happen again. Hubris. Mark Carney made a definite mistake. It was accelerated by a change of circumstance. It was not a black swan event. As one of the world's most respected central bankers, Carney apparently believed he had the authority to frighten the British voters into rejecting Brexit by threatening an economic collapse. And again, I'll stop there, because so did head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde. And these people are all players on the same team. They are all for the establishment. They are all for the NWO. They are puppets themselves, and as I've covered before, these people are also part of secret societies. For instance, Mark Carney comes from a Malta Brotherhood, and you can find out when you do some research on him, as well as a few other organisations. If you don't believe all these world leaders are connected through Freemasonic orders, then you'd better get teaching yourself, because the world's not as it seems. This whole system has been designed and is being driven towards what it is that the agendas are wanting. Problem, reaction, solution. It's as simple as that. Back on topic. As one of the world's most respected central bankers, Carney apparently believed he had the authority to frighten the British voters into rejecting Brexit by threatening an economic apocalypse. His public utterances ahead of the vote ensured sterling would crash and financial markets with it. When the vote went Brexit's way, that event in June is clearly reflected in the chart above. Having dug himself into a hole of his own making, Carney then dug even deeper. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, he continued to believe his own propaganda, that the consequences of Brexit would be dire on a medium-term view. Without waiting for confirmation, the Bank of England cut interest rates and announced a further round of bond purchases. Sterling is taking it on the chin. Such is the groupthink in the bank and in the city that there was no one credible with the same sense to advise caution. Large financial corporations are still lobbying furiously for a quasi-Remain solution to Brexit, with continuing access to Europe's broken financial system. If they are threatening to move to Frankfurt, Paris, and now even New York, the outlook for Britain must be bleak. Doubtless, Carney and Co. continue to blame Brexit for sterling's accelerating collapse, as well as rogue traders. And I think this is referring to a magazine called Viz, the flash crash last week. The problem with hubris is the blame always lies elsewhere. And in fact, I'll just double check that as well. Anyway guys, this is the magazine, Viz. I had a quick look for 5 minutes, but wasn't able to actually locate the October edition he's referring to, so I'll just carry on. The problem with hubris is the blame always lies elsewhere. The Prime Minister and her Chancellor have also been unhelpful. At the Conservative Party conference, greater economic intervention was promised, and the Prime Minister herself stepped over the boundary of the bank's independence by criticising QE. The Chancellor's remarks perhaps reflecting the opinions of her officials. Similarly, unhelpful for sterling, and it has since emerged that Treasury civil servants are trying to subvert Brexit, fearing loss of tax revenue. Investors and traders now have to contend with a sharply different market environment. Referring back to the introductory chart, it is clear the best performing money for hapless Brits has been gold. Gold has risen this year, priced in all the major fiat currencies, which tells us that commodity inputs to price inflation around the world are turning positive. This is confirmed by the following chart based on the St. Louis Fed's Producer Price Index for all commodities adjusted by the sterling exchange rate and indexed to October 2011. The implied inflation rate, smoothed over 4 quarters, is the red line plotted on the right-hand scale. Wholesale price inflation on this measure bottomed strongly negative in the middle of 2015, but since then has become strongly positive. Thus is partly due to the dollar PPI rising by 20% from January this year, but the rest is due to sterling's weakness. The root of everything we buy is the commodities and raw materials in this index. When we buy services, we pay service providers who in turn will spend some of the money on goods, and their services providers in turn will equally spend a portion on goods. Therefore, producer prices are fundamental to all economies, including one like the UK, in which an estimated 80% of GDP is represented by the service sector. To see PPI inflation running at 25% over minus 25% is therefore an extremely serious issue. Consensus forecasts for the UK price inflation do not appear to take this sufficiently into account. The Bank of England, in its August inflation report, expected price inflation to be only 2% in 3 years' time. Though independent forecasts have expected it to be somewhat higher, perhaps 2.5%, by the end of the year. However, the fall in sterling is forcing analysts to reverse inflation forecast upwards, with Deutsche Bank saying, quote, higher import prices should add nearly 4% to CPI over 3 years. However, if sterling bears predicting a further 10% decline prove correct, inflation's 25-year high of 5.2% may be threatened, end quote. Fast FT, July the 11th. Since that report, sterling fell by a further 10% in last week's flash crash. Though it has recovered somewhat, there is no doubt that the UK price inflation in 2017 is the one subject analysis will be waking up to in the coming weeks. But it's not just the fall in sterling that will push the consumer price index significantly higher, but commodity prices as well. One thing's for sure, a swing in sterling's PPI inflation from minus 25% to plus 25% in only 15 months will have a major and generally underestimated effect on headline price inflation. The Bank of England's published forecast is a make-believe, and it is frightening that the MPC through inflation would remain under its 2% target to the point where it felt a cut in its minimum lending rate was warranted. With the bank going one way on interest rates and reality the other, the only way to prevent further devaluation is for the pound to jack up interest rates as soon as possible before further damage is done. So guys, what Alasdair is basically saying there is if Mark Carney doesn't increase the interest rates, then the pound is going to depreciate even further over the coming weeks and months. And as we all know, they are trying to crash the system. What they will do is they will flood the market with even more QE to prop up all the failing positions and quite likely lower interest rates even further, while other nations around the world continue into further negative rates and further quantitative easing. And then, as we know, there's the huge push for war. You've got other articles coming out that they are trying to create the biggest bubble known to mankind. And as we already know, we are in a severe bubble. Why would they want to fix the bubble? The whole objective is to create as much capital for the elites inside of the system to then pull the rug, leave even the whole thing destroyed, and everybody's wealth or perceived wealth worthless, simply because of the flooding of currencies. If you've worked your whole life and you've saved up your retirement, and when you were saving it you believed that the money that you've saved will be enough, why is it that you have people coming out saying you're going to need 3 or 4 times what you believe you need? It's called hyperinflation. They are inflating the markets. They are inflating the bubbles. It's why you see house prices skyrocketing in values over the last few years. This is all a bubble that's going to pop. It's all a bubble that's been designed to pop. These guys are not stupid. These guys know exactly what they are doing. They're just following orders from the people that are really in control. It's not incompetence. It's design. It really is moving into a prison planet. And if you can't see that when this rug is pulled, that millions, if they're not killed by some form of war, they'll probably be killed by starvation because of lack of funds, lack of work, lack of value in the fiat currency note that they hold. So he goes on to the seed of stagflation. The Bank of England raising rates immediately is extremely unlikely, so we face the unwanted prospect of stagflation. The Bank of England's monetary policy will be torn between 2 contrasting objectives, a stagflating economy and an escalating price inflation, kind of like what I just said. The economists at the bank will want to keep interest rates down to encourage growth, while markets will demand higher interest rates all along the yield curve, forcing up the cost of borrowing for government, corporations and consumers. It's all about debt, guys. If we repeat the experience of the 70s, which we seem fated to do, both the Treasury and the bank will persist in the view that markets are wrong and that they are right. They will tough it out until a good old-fashioned sterling crisis changes their minds. Or war. Or false flags. Black swans. The bank's mistakes in monetary policy will have far-reaching implications. The level of mortgage debt in the UK is at a record high, so residential property prices are likely to take very bad hits from significantly higher interest rates. And guys, that is what leads to mass underwater situations. And that is where there becomes a flood in the market of sales, people trying to get out of their situation, knowing that the market is collapsing. Now the smart people have already got out. They can see this is happening. There'll be a realization phase when the market gets hit and mortgages start to freeze up because banks are no longer liquid in mortgage funds. They then do the opposite. They try to draw in as much of the outlaid debt to cover their balance sheets. And that is when repossessions start to take place. And what happens to a society when repossessions take place? These banks try to sell off these properties, but nobody has the capital to buy these properties unless you have a lot of cash. And that just isn't reality for most people. So what happens to the valuations of these houses in a situation like that? Do you think they remain at the levels they are today? And that is why you're going to be seeing a 50% decline in the value of houses. And a lot of people will go, you're talking rubbish. You've got no idea what you're talking about. Let's just watch. These prices will get slashed big time because there won't be the buyers for them. And it's always an age-old thing. Something is only worth what somebody is willing to pay. And if people don't have anything of capital to exchange, then a reality sets in on the mind of the people that believe a house is worth a high inflated value, but they can't sell it for that value. So if they want out, they accept what somebody is willing to pay. So it's going to be very interesting times for people who are in positions to make acquisitions. Hence, blood in the street. That's the time to buy. Not now. You shouldn't be taking out 95% mortgages with 5% down, because you're going to be ripped to pieces in this market. Getting back on topic again. The inability of many businesses to pass on higher input price to cash-strapped consumers will lead to a downward in economic activity, fall in profits and wages in real terms, and increased unemployment. That's what I mean, guys. If you've got an increased unemployment level, people can't sustain the mortgage rates, especially with increasing interest rates. You can just see the catastrophe pending in the distance. It's all laid out for us right here. It's all around us. You can read it, you can understand it, you just have to have the eyes to see it. Too many people are blinkered by the belief system that they have. And my God, they're in for such an awakening. When this shit goes down, and so many people get ripped of everything they have, it's going to be disastrous for the average person. A lot of people will actually quite likely just commit suicide because they can't cope with the situation. And that's reality right there. People will get so screwed up with this fake fiat monetary system, they will kill themselves over an associated debt number. So if that isn't a prison without requiring handcuffs and bars, tell me what is. Carrying on. Savings, which have been progressively channeled out of the bank deposits and into speculative capital assets, will suffer losses because levels of debt today are far higher than they were in the last stagflation episode in the 1970s. The fallout from Carney's mistake threatens to be considerably greater today. Commodity outlook rubs salt in the wounds, as if the pound's problems were not enough. The medium-term outlook for commodities is also from rising dollar-denominated prices. The reason this is so is that the Chinese economy, which the IMF and Western economists routinely criticize, is being deliberately refocused away from low-value production towards higher technology products and a massive infrastructure program covering much of Asia. The resurgence of the dollar, which is behind commodity price softness in the last 2 weeks, is therefore likely to prove temporary. That being the case, it is clear that the US economy also faces stagflation, if only on a lower scale than the UK. It is for this reason that the rise in dollar interest rates also seems inevitable. In fact, wholesale markets are already pricing dollar credit well above the Fed fund rate, indicating prima facie that the FFR should be 0.5% higher. This trend of higher wholesale interest rates has been in place for some time, as the next chart clearly shows. The 3-month LIBOR percentage. Furthermore, when the Fed raises its Fed funds rate, it is more than likely the interbank rate will rise above it, encouraging the Fed into a game of interest rate leapfrog, because the 12-month LIBOR rate is already at 1.58%, so we can conclude that the Fed is well behind the interest rate curve already, reflecting the classic stagflation dilemma. The imperative to resist rising interest rates before the economy faces capacity constraints contrasts with the growing need to raise interest rates to curb price inflation. The Fed is currently choosing to ignore the inflation outlook. Basically, print to oblivion, guys. And as we know, all the bonds are coming flooding back into the US markets. People aren't accepting the US dollar in exchange. Regarding the other story from Jim Willie that I did, they're not accepting bonds or US dollar in payment. So basically all this stuff is getting really quite tense and close to the wire. And a lot of people are calling that out at the moment. This being the case, it appears that the Fed, in a milder way, is caught in the same trap as the Bank of England. It will only raise interest rates significantly as a last resort, when forced to do so by the markets. The idea that markets, after all, will disrupt their monetary plans have always been extremely unwelcome and strongly resisted by central bankers everywhere. Rising dollar interest rates will also provide a severe test for the ECB's monetary policies, European Central Bank, and threaten the Eurozone's banking system. But the path to the Euro's losses of purchasing power has bigger factors at play than simply stagflation. The Bank of Japan faces other difficulties, and stagflation is not an immediate concern there. It is the two Anglo-Saxon currencies whose issuers believe in both free markets and state management at the same time, where the dangers of stagflation are most odious. Free markets and state management are like oil and water, and simply don't mix. State management of both interest rates and the quantity of money and dupes the general public for a while, but not forever. And when the ordinary person wakes up to the decline in the purchasing power of his money, he reduces his cash liquidity in preference for ownership of consumer goods. No matter the higher interest rates bankrupt and the over-indebted. No matter that rise in unemployment leads to a general sense of job insecurity. No matter that the majority of people have little or no cash liquidity. Those that do not have cash and start to accumulate the necessities of life may be a growing minority, but they are sufficient in the number to drive up retail prices by creating inventory shortages. They are the first to realise that raw material and other processing costs are rising and that the purchasing power of their money is falling. The realisation spreads, which is why stagflation leads to hyperinflation unless it is halted. Stopping it means forgetting monetary policy objectives and either letting the market determine rates, in which case the ability of banks to create credit out of thin air has to be curtailed, perhaps by the threat to their own insolvency. Other rates are deliberately raised by the central bank high enough to crash the economy. It was the market that forced the reluctant Bank of England to accept reality in 1975, principally through bankruptcies in the commercial property market, which is where the leverage was at that time, and in their lenders, the secondary banks. By way of contrast, the Fed chaired by Paul Volcker took the initiative over markets in 1981, jacking up interest rates until the economy stalled and people preferred money again to spending it. This time around, US government debt to GDP is over 100%. In 1980, it was about 30%. In the UK, most houses were mortgage-free in the 1970s. Today, 80% plus percent mortgages are typical. The consequences of markets regaining control over interest rates are considerably more dangerous today. Volcker's interest rates policies was practical 25 years ago, in that fallout was generally containable. We cannot say that is true now, with all the debt that would default. This has always been a basic argument for not putting trust in fiat currencies. Instead, having a form of money whose purchasing power is more stable in terms of commodities and raw materials. The Bank of England's inept monetary policy under Mark Carney's governorship seems certain to expose the fragility of fiat sterling to wider public attention and skepticism. If the consequences weren't so serious, we might thank him for the unwittingly toppling the status quo. But the inevitable crisis, many times worse than that faced in 1975, cannot be embraced even by the most extreme financial masochist. This is why people in Britain and America will increasingly find solace in gold. And that is the report by Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Please do leave your comments. I'll see you in the next one.